Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's session. This is a very timely event. We're all looking to Canada with a mixed sense of not doom.
I'm going to off for a moment then, Mike.
Perhaps optimism. But then we hope to get a framework that we can work to. We hope to have some tools and some financial mechanisms that we can use. And then it's how do we make the decisions and how do we know what's working? And this afternoon we are celebrating Bill's work and this book, Transforming Conservation, and the whole discipline of evidence and reviewing evidence, using evidence to drive decision making and building it into our daily lives as conservationists. I've actually been reading, I've skimmed through a chapter this afternoon and it's looking at the effectiveness of experts. And yes, I think I'll say the comment. As Executive Director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, I work with so many experts, so I'm going to be giving this chapter a lot of attention. So we've got a great lineup this afternoon. I'm going to be introducing Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England, to say a few words. Mark Burgman will be joining us from Australia, and he's with the Centre for Environmental Policy, Imperial College. Our own Nancy Ockendon from the DAB and the Endangered Landscapes Programme. Nibedita Mukherjee, who's online already, Department of Social and Political Sciences, Brunel. Nibu, thank you for joining us. And then Dilys from IIED, and a lot of you know Dilys and her work in wildlife and biodiversity within IIED. And then we'll come back for a few words with Professor Bill Sutherland, Miriam Rothschild, Professor in Conservation Biology, and part of the founding team for the whole concept of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative in the David Attenborough Building. So it's my pleasure to bring Tony Juniper. Tony.
Thank you, Mike.
We all know Tony. On parrots as well as a general agitator for good.
Was once maybe, Mike, you could say. Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Mike correctly identified me as the chairman of Natural England, but I've been lucky enough to have a pretty long career in conservation, sustainability, environmental subjects now going back on for 40 years. And this has been through working as a conservation scientist. I spent a bit of time working at BirdLife International, spent a lot of time working at Friends of the Earth as a campaigner. I've advised major companies. I worked for a spell with the Prince of Wales. I've written various pieces about all of these subjects, and now I'm the chairman of Natural England. Spent some time at WWF, leading the campaigns there too. And I think if there's one thing that you can point to say what made any of that effective or gain traction or creative influence, it is about evidence, facts, data, and having some grounding for the different ways in which we're trying to create some level of positive change. And it's particularly important when you're in contested spaces. And so my work at Natural England, I don't think I've ever been in a more kind of divided spectrum of issues in terms of all the things that we're trying to bring forward, all of the positive shifts we're trying to create to support the government in its ambition, which is now pretty good, protected areas, getting them into better shape, bringing forward a nature recovery network, halting and reversing species decline, having 30% of the country protected in some way for nature by 2030. All of these things that are individually quite complicated in terms of the discipline of conservation, but they become extremely complicated when they're placed into the wider context of all the other interests that need to be accommodated. So one of the policies that we're trying to bring forward now to help advance this goal of restoring the natural environment is a shift in the agricultural subsidies away from payments for managing land for food production and turning them into ecosystem service payments. So what's going to work? what's the best value for the taxpayers' money? How can we evolve the schemes that we've already got and turn those into things that are forward-facing, are going to go in that transition from subsidy to payments for things that are being achieved? A really complicated and difficult area, and one which can only be resolved through having good evidence. Because there are real interests here, economic interests in terms of farmers who wish to maintain their livelihood. Quite correctly, of course, we need them to be doing that in order to underpin food security. But at the same time, how can we make good decisions based upon things that are going to lead to good outcomes? So that is a critical element in what we're now trying to work through, is coming forward with evidence as to what has worked in the past and what's going to deliver the outcomes that we need in the future. Another is the fraught subject of biodiversity net gain. How will we know whether we've got a benefit arising from this particular mechanism linked to house building and infrastructure, and to be confident that we can say what you've done here is actually meeting the criteria? House builders who might be keen to maybe make this more simple, more straightforward, perhaps less demanding, how do we lift up their ambition and encourage them to see the possibilities at hand? Again, having evidence as to how we make good decisions and underpin that with the right kind of data is absolutely critical. Got a big ambition in England now to make good land use decisions in pursuit of net zero carbon. What is the right way of doing that? Big discussions going on at the moment around what kind of woodlands we might wish to establish. Some people might see the establishment of fast-growing conifers as being the best way to catch as much carbon as possible. Other people might say, actually, what we should be investing in is the re-establishment of large areas of native broadleaf woodland in mosaics of scrubland interspersed with grass in order to maximise biodiversity at the same time as catching carbon. Again, what is going to be the best way of directing the public investment to achieve the best possible fit of outcomes beyond even net zero, to be embracing parallel goals for biodiversity conservation and nature recovery, and also indeed for other things like water quality and flood risk reduction. And then the whole fraught subject of nature-based solutions, including those which might be receiving investment through some kind of other offset. How do we know those are working? What's the evidence base we need? What are the standards that need to be established? What is the minimum amount of information that can unleash a deal between an investor and somebody delivering the improvement in nature on the ground? So all of this stuff is extremely complicated and often quite political, in the sense of there being different opinions about how we should go forward, with sometimes economic interests trying to defend their particular business interests in ways that might compromise conservation. And the way to cut through that always is with good data and good arguments. And on top of all of this, of course, is a big cultural dimension to the debate that goes on at the moment. And probably the biggest one that comes across my desk now is the debate about rewilding, and the extent to which, you know, letting land go, some people would see it as a cultural reaction against something which is going against the grain of how things have traditionally looked. What evidence have we got to underpin that, to help us cut through those cultural barriers that are out there? So the way I see it, and have seen it through all of the work that I've done over many years, is being able to find ways forward through coming with good evidence. But I just finish with one remark about the extent to which it's never enough on its own, because all of these things that we're trying to do, they are complicated, and not only in the sense of the data that we're trying to analyse and the particular problems that we're trying to solve, but also in that wider context, which is why framing and communication and having strategy is absolutely critical for how we use evidence. Evidence on its own will only get us so far. If we're going to be successful, we have to put other pieces into the mix as well, including those critical social and policy dimensions. But I've no doubt this book will be an absolutely brilliant contribution to the debate. I know the work that Will has been doing with the team here for many years. It really is making a difference, and certainly the colleagues at Natural England, who spend a lot of time poring over evidence, thinking of ways of creating the best possible impact with it, will be reading this and will be putting it to very good use. So congratulations, Bill, and everyone, for a great contribution to the ongoing discussion about how we best harness data and evidence to get the change that we need. Thank you.
Very interesting key point there, that nexus between the evidence and what you do with the evidence is such a political space. And so that's where we're tested as communicators. And just a quick note, we'll be doing questions over a glass of wine after the event rather than after each speaker. So is Mark ready to join us? Yeah, I can see Mark there. 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. It's very difficult to speak for 10 minutes on a topic on which you could speak for 3 days without drawing a breath, but I'll do my best. I think Bill asked me not to speak about the book in particular, but to speak about judgments, decision-making, and evidence in general. But I'm going to break ranks and disobey him. I don't do that lightly. I think this book is particularly special because the scope of the book tells you exactly how difficult it is to combine the elements that we need to make good judgments and to have impact in the ways in which we want it to happen. Conservation biology is a very difficult business because we often we experience a lack of data, a lack of understanding. Our decisions are urgent and imminent. The consequences of poor decisions are often have significant consequences, and they are the sorts of things that one can't backtrack from. They're decisions that lead to outcomes that can't be remediated. So it's a difficult business, and we are really professionally obliged to make as good a use as possible of the information that we have, and not to mislead ourselves with our own preferences and our own prejudices in making those decisions. And all of that rests on evidence and on the correct interpretation of evidence. And I think the book has taught me that we still have a very long way to go to reconcile all of it is that we don't know about how to make good decisions, how to combine evidence, how to weigh evidence. And the brave thing about this book is it takes all of those dimensions on. It addresses the way in which problems are framed, the challenges that go with appropriately including the right kinds of people, the people who either can influence a decision or who bear the consequences of that decision, how to engage with people in an effective way, how to compile elements of evidence, weigh them, and then aggregate them into a form that can contribute in a sensible way to a decision. How to structure the thinking around the estimating different pieces of evidence when we don't have the time or the resources to collect those data directly, and so on. It's a remarkable achievement. It's no less remarkable because it has Bill's fingerprints or his footprints or his boot prints all over it. It's not something that in which he said, "Can you please just come back with a chapter and that'll be fine." He has deeply involved himself in every one of these chapters, including the ones in which he's not an author, and it's been a really very well, it's a remarkable achievement, and I just wanted to say that I think Bill has done an outstanding thing getting this done. I know he doesn't want me to say these things. He wants me to talk about decision making in general, but I think the essence of this book provides us with a starting point to make qualitatively better decisions in many, many different and challenging circumstances, including those of the kind that confront Nature England and like organizations and jurisdictions around the world. I think the kinds of things that we will find in this book are going to be the sorts of things that each of us confront daily. And it is structured in a way that one can dip into the book, into a chapter, into a part of a chapter, and find a way of working, way of thinking, an analysis, a way of approaching a problem that is practical and accessible. And those things are an achievement in themselves. The future, I think, of decision making and of using evidence will rest on things such as a reliable and verifiable way of weighing and combining evidence. Now, we have some ways of doing that, but they're not complete and they're not universal. It will rest on approaches to structured reasoning and structured decision making that allow us to find well-reasoned, transparent, and effective solutions that satisfy people and that satisfy our social objectives in doing so. And those book's remarkable because it has many of the answers, and clearly in places where there are no answers, it tells us so. And I think all of those things together make this a very important book, a milestone in conservation science, and something that certainly I've already started to refer my students to. So it's already circulating amongst our masters and PhD students, and it's required reading for our master's program the day it hit the shelves, which was yesterday, I think. But thank you very much, Bill, for getting this done, and I look forward to seeing it cited often and in great detail.
Mark mentioned an interesting point which got me thinking that one of the challenges we have is so much conservation now is also emotionally driven. So it's providing that balancing act between the evidence and the emotion. And if we were just a closed church of scientists talking to each other, there probably wouldn't be that emotional thing. But if we're to succeed, we've got to work with a wide range of communities. And I think it's finding ways of delivering that evidence in a way that is compatible and is accessible to the vast majority of people. So Nancy, where's Nancy? Nancy's behind me. So I'm going to introduce Nancy Ockendon. You know Nancy from the Endangered Landscapes Programme, and it's all about is restoration working. Nancy, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me to write the chapter and inviting me to talk today. So we've heard from Tony and Mark about the importance of using evidence in decision making. But I'm going to talk a bit about where that evidence comes from, and particularly how we might be able to make a step change and a transformation in evidence generation for decision making in conservation. So I am the science manager on the Endangered Landscapes Programme, and with a couple of other really great conservation researchers and practitioners, was the author of a chapter on how we can generate more evidence through practice. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of those ideas and particularly how we apply them within the ELP. So I thought I should start with a really quick introduction to the Endangered Landscapes Programme. So this is a kind of one slide overview. As the title says, the programme aims to restore natural processes, biodiversity and habitats at large scales to provide benefits for people and for nature. And we do this primarily by funding large-scale restoration projects across Europe. We're generously funded by Arcadia, and we're based here in the CCI. We got underway in 2018, and we currently have 15 landscape scale restoration projects funded across Europe. You can see the geographical spread on the map, and also the kind of some of the diversity of ecosystems we're working across. So these range from things like forest restoration and peatland restoration in the Highlands of Scotland, grassland restoration in the steppes of Georgia, and marine restoration in the Mediterranean off the coast of Turkey. So lots of different contexts, lots of different decisions to be made. I don't think I need to spend long on this slide. It's been well and truly covered by Tony and Mark. I think and hope most people think we need to make evidence-informed decisions. The resources we've got available for conservation are limited, so it's really important that we use them as effectively as we can, whether that be in conservation practice or policy, as Tony outlined. So for this, we really need an evidence base that's both broad and deep. So it covers lots of different kind of conservation and restoration actions, and also lots of different contexts and species. And at the moment, the evidence base we've got is kind of not really up to the job. So we really need to find some new ways to generate evidence and the rate at which that happens. And I think thinking of ways that we can generate and create new evidence as part of conservation and restoration projects, as part of practice, is probably part of the solution. So this is a figure that's in our chapter in the book. I've adapted it and made it even more ugly. But basically the aim is to show how projects can fit into cycle of evidence generation and also into feeding in and out of the wider evidence space. So the stuff on the left, the blue arrows is kind of what's going on within a single project, and the green arrows are how that kind of feeds into wider conservation and restoration evidence and decision making. A couple of key things to take from this figure. One bit is that text in yellow at the top. The importance of advanced planning, like really designing data collection, designing implementation for any sort of boots get muddy, spades are in the ground. That can really just make an enormous difference to the value of the data, and particularly how it can be used beyond a single site. And the other thing, I guess, is all those arrows going into and out of the wider evidence space. So the importance of sharing results from a single project, whether that be through publishing articles or other ways of making them freely available, to really build that evidence space. When I go and talk to our projects on the ground about how they're making their decisions and what the evidence they're using, often they'll say, but there's no evidence for my site. And rightly, they'll say, my site is different. It's got a different species. It's got a different land management history. So the more data we can collect about the outcomes of different actions in those different geographic locations, the effects on different species, the more easy it will be to extrapolate the data and make predictions about what will happen in a new site. So I'm just going to focus now on this bit on the left-hand side of the figure about what's going on within a project, particularly how we do it in the ELP, which is firstly via monitoring, and secondly via trials. And as I've said, both of these kinds of data collection are designed at the start of the project. So our projects, we work with them at the proposal stage to really plan what kind of data they're going to collect through the course of the project. And we also ask that as those data become available, we share them. So start with monitoring. It's probably something you're all really familiar with. It's really common in conservation, nature reserves, projects, protected areas globally. So there's lots and lots of money, resources, effort going into monitoring, and it produces loads of data, which is great. But I think there is potential for it to become more useful, particularly with that kind of strategic thinking and advanced planning about how the data can be used and collected. Within the ELP, we ask projects to monitor their progress towards their outcomes from their log frames. So it's really about measuring the progress of projects. And we have a monitoring framework, which is kind of specifically designed for landscape restoration projects that could be easily used by anyone else, and that's freely available on our website. We ask that indicators are spread across the sort of diversity of impacts and changes that we hope our projects will have. So starting with looking at changes in biodiversity and natural capital, then looking at the ecosystem services, some of the things Tony was talking about that flow from that. And finally, measuring benefits to people in terms of social and economic benefits that come from landscape restoration. So we really want to get a kind of holistic picture of the changes that are coming as a result of our project work. The thing we ask our projects about each of the sort of indicator data they're collecting is attribution. So if you measure a change in one of these indicators, will you be able to say that that's due to the activities you've undertaken? What kind of confidence will you have in that? And another thing we ask is about how they're going to use that data. So what's the purpose? Is it going to be used in decision making? Are you going to share it with other people? So for example, if they're looking at something like survival of saplings in a woodland restoration project, they might feed that back into their future management. If they're looking at number of raptors or some charismatic predator, they might be using that to inspire people about what landscape restoration can deliver. So really making sure the data they collect is going to be used and provide value for money. Then moving on to the trials. So these are an experimental component that we ask all ELP funded projects to include to really build the evidence of what does and doesn't work across the different dimensions of restoration. The aim is to generate new knowledge, which can be applied both within the project by adaptive management, but it also is important that it can be used elsewhere as wider relevance. So share the results. One thing we spend quite a lot of time talking to our projects about is what is the question you can practically and realistically and robustly answer within the sort of scope of the project you're working on. And we really encourage them to look at sort of simple tests of single actions. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this in the next slide. And we also ask them to think about experimental design at the beginning. So thinking about will replication, will including comparisons, will randomization help you draw conclusions from your data? And these may not all be possible, but I think it's important to think about at the start of a project. So this is a figure from the book, which actually is taken from a paper we published last year in Ecological Solutions and Evidence. And the aim of this figure is to really identify the enabling factors which allow you to design an effective experiment in conservation. And also, more important, just as importantly, when you shouldn't include an experiment. So we kind of thought there are three different sort of conditions or things that need to be in place that make it a good time to put in an experiment. The first one, that sort of pink circle on the left, is there's an important question to answer. So maybe there's a decision you're making about management and there's some uncertainty about the best way forward. So the data you're going to generate is really going to make a difference to the project.
See, a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. The yellow circle talks about the availability of expertise, resources, and equipment. So have you got what you need, or do you need to maybe find a collaborator? And the blue circle is it possible to integrate an experiment kind of easily? So maybe you're doing something multiple times. If you're removing a dam in a river, it might be quite difficult to do an experiment. But if you're treating an invasive plant in your nature reserve and you have 20 different areas you need to treat, maybe you can compare two different possible treatments. I just thought I'd finish, I think, with some examples of some of the trials our projects are using. So just to quickly say, for example, in Scotland, they're looking at what's the best way to create deadwood for different communities of deadwood invertebrates using a randomized replicated controlled trial. In the Georgian steppe, they're looking at different ways of restoring this really super degraded grassland, comparing impacts of adding manure, adding green hay, or using rotational grazing to see which is the most effective at recovering these landscapes. In the Lake District in the north of England, there's a social science question being asked about the impacts of citizen science and what benefits people get from engaging within it, using sort of qualitative methods and surveys. And finally, in Bulgaria, they're looking at restoring native woodland to steep slopes and poor soils, and looking at which tree species survive best and what kind of post-planting management they need. So I hope here I've just really explained that it is possible to integrate experiments into conservation practice. And it may even be actually quite straightforward to do it. And it will provide real benefits, both for the projects themselves and the wider community. And we're excited to share the results with these with you, which should be coming out in the coming years. Thank you.
See, I saw one member of our audience react very happily to the project in Georgia, so there we are. So, we're going to invite Nibedita Mukherjee to join us. Nibu, are you there? Yes, I can see you.
Yes.
Right, your turn, Nibu. 10 minutes, please.
If I can get tech to work.
There we are.
Yeah, okay. Can you guys see my slides or? Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Mike, for the introduction to the experts in this wonderful book, which has been collated and edited by Bill. It has been a fantastic effort in the middle of the pandemic, and it was an absolute joy to work with a great team of authors. So here, if I may move this a bit. Yeah, so we have a wonderful team of authors for chapter 5. It was led by Bonnie Wintle, and we had a lot of interactions with Victoria Hemming and Marissa McBride and Stefano Canessa as well. So today's talk would be drawing from some of the key messages that we have shared in this chapter. And the chapter is titled Improving the Reliability of Judgments, though we would be focusing mostly on experts. So decision-making has a lot of constraints, as the first speaker today mentioned. We do have challenges with regards to evidence. When we do have evidence, we need to think about how much certainty do we have about the evidence. There are, of course, time constraints, and since we're all humans, we have certain blind spots in our decision-making process. And most importantly, as Mark pointed out, there's of course a lot of external pressure which guides the impact of these decisions. So who are going to be benefiting from these decisions? Who are going to pay the costs for these decisions? And as we know, evidence has been growing quite significantly in the last decade or so, and for several years on. So synthesizing this evidence often can be a Himalayan challenge. And what starts off maybe as a simple analysis can simply lead to information overload. And I'm very grateful to members in the conservation evidence team who do this on a very regular basis. I think we all owe them quite a lot for preparing such wonderful synthesis, which we can use readily for informing policy and practice. So what do we do when we have so much evidence? One pathway is to rely on expert judgment. This is taken from a UN meeting, which involved around 450 different experts working on the environment, trying to synthesize evidence in such a way that it could be taken up by policymakers in 197 countries. But experts, as we all know, can be quite challenging to deal with for a variety of reasons. Not the least would be, first of all, lack of evidence for the specific research question or the policy question that we might be trying to answer. There could also be different ways in which the evidence is interpreted and evidence pulling us in different directions, so conflicting evidence. When we work with a team of experts, often there are disciplinary silos and disciplinary biases that creep in, and this could also be resulting from the methodological biases that different fields have evolved, think, and work towards. The way it impacts decision-making could be from the individual biases that arise in the decision-making process or in the group interactions that are often encountered in expert-based judgments. And experts, as we all know, are very good at thinking that they know best. But do they really? This is from a paper by our very own Mark Burgman. And here the paper shows that peers as well as self-assessment of experts are very well correlated, to a correlation coefficient being 0.85. So when an expert thinks that he knows about a particular thing, their peers also think that they are an expert on that particular thing. But when it is tested, often the correlation is not that sound. And so the straight line, the filled line is that from round 1, and the dotted line is from round 2 of an iterative questionnaire. And often the way the peers graded the experts, or the level of expertise, did not often correlate with the efficacy or the accuracy of their judgments. And the expertise on any particular topic falls randomly when falls exponentially when we pick experts who are not specifically an expert on that particular topic. So beyond a person's area of work, that person may not be able to provide expertise on a research question. So for the ladies in the audience, I'd like you to kindly excuse the extreme gender bias, but this is a real life situation. And sitting in the middle, if you can see my cursor, probably is Brazil with a red tie, and with its team members, Paraguay and Uruguay, close by. So they are fighting for removing the term sustainable meat consumption from the UN report. And on the other side of the game, we have people from UK and Netherlands trying to put in sustainable meat consumption in the report. And we have a very smiling person from South Africa sitting in the middle, negotiating between the developed North and the developing South. And in the end, we succeeded in bringing sustainable meat consumption to the report. So often these judgments of experts can be in very contested spaces, with people bringing in their own biases and their values and also their agendas. And it requires a huge amount of skill to navigate between these spaces and make sure that people do not come to fisticuffs. So I've highlighted a couple of biases here, and there's a list in the chapter, which is table 5.1, where you can read in greater detail. So one of the common biases that we encounter in groups is groupthink, where when a dominant person says something, whether we agree or disagree with a particular decision, everybody says yes on the surface, but internally they might be thinking that it's a terrible idea. So this is very common because people do not want to be the odd one out. Similarly, we have dominance effect and gender biases as well. So we may be having a very senior person of very high position in the meeting. And when that person says something, everybody else agrees, even though they might not agree with the factual nature of the decision. Similar for the framing effect. Here we see two different pictures of having the same result, but the way the information is presented has huge impact in which it is received. And this is another psychological bias which affects the way decisions are made. But perhaps one of the dangerous ones is between in-group versus out-group thinking, a classic experiment done by Jane Elliott, and I have shared the YouTube link to this as well. It was a classic experiment in which, the blue-eyed versus the brown-eyed boys were asked to, pair together to work in groups, and we could very easily see that groups forming very quickly and how much animosity can be created within such groups, even amongst children. And this often affects decision-making within groups as well, particularly when they're divided along either their practitioner lines or the professions, or maybe their disciplinary biases. So here's a list of common biases that we normally encounter either as individuals or as groups when we encounter group decision-making processes. Some of them are very specific to expert-based groups, but others could have much wider implications. Now, switching gears, how do we solve or address these very complicated issues? So table 5.2 and 5.3 in the book points us towards some of the strategies that may be useful in addressing. So it's not possible to completely remove or eliminate the issue of bias in decision making, but we do have certain strategies which may help us in reducing the impact of biases and making it more rational in the decision making. So these could include having the devil's advocates or considering the opposite of a particular option that is being discussed, and so on and so forth. And similar, we have solutions for groups. So for example, anonymity can reduce a huge amount of social pressures that affect decisions. So once we remove the social pressures, then the best judgment or the best opinion can emerge from a group. And this could help in, if it is tied up with something that is iterative and with feedback, then it also improves the judgment from one round to another. So the book talks about not just one, but several, about 5 structured decision-making techniques, which can be adopted to make such processes more rational. One of them is the Delphi technique. The second one is the idea protocol, which was developed by Mark Burgman's group. There's also nominal group technique, prediction market, and super forecasters. In the interest of time, I'll just talk very briefly about the Delphi technique, simply because I'm a bit more familiar with it. And I know my time is up. So just very briefly, the Delphi is an iterative technique. It's online, it's anonymous, and has been heavily used in group decision-making processes to make decisions more rational. And with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for your attention.
In there. So Dilys, the floor is yours. So again, a 10-minute instruction.
So I'd just like to apologise for my very hastily thrown together slides. I wasn't expecting to speak today, but I made the mistake of letting Bill know I was in the building this morning. Myself here when I was hoping to be sitting at the back drinking a glass of water. Let's not be getting the slides sorted. Just to say, my name's Dilys. I work for IID, which is a sustainable development think tank based in London. But I've hung around the DAB a lot since it opened. I also have a role with IUCN, so I do actually have a seat upstairs. But IID's worked a lot with CCI members as a partner on a variety of initiatives. So I kind of consider CCI home. I work a lot on community-based conservation, mainly in Africa. So Bill asked me if I was interested in contributing to the chapter in the book, which is all about engaging communities. And I said, yes, I was. But when I started looking through the draft of the book, I said, I'm actually really interested in the chapter on evidence-based policy, and that really resonates with some of the work that I've been doing at IID. So can I contribute to that one either instead or as well? So I contributed a little bit to both of these chapters, but this is the one that I want to talk about today. So I think this chapter really resonates with work that I do on biodiversity mainstreaming, which is really all about sort of trying to get decision makers who aren't particularly interested in biodiversity and who have other priorities such as development interested in biodiversity and trying to integrate it into their policy making and decision making. And I think one of the things that I've found working in that area is that as a scientist, there can be a tendency to just assume that if you produce good quality information and evidence, that you just put it out there and people will use it. But actually they don't. You have to really work at getting decision makers to notice your evidence, think that it's relevant, and then think about applying it. So just in the chapter, there are two, this is the one diagram and this table of principles, which really strike me as relevant to my work. And the first thing here is about the need to create and build demand for evidence. And there's also an issue here about understanding what the demand is for evidence. And the other key issue is this one about communicating evidence in ways that your audience will understand. So you need to communicate evidence differently to different audiences. And I remember once at a conference being hauled up by a philosopher about this, who said he was very concerned about my moral compass because I would tell economists that biodiversity had economic value, and then I'd talk about its intrinsic value if I was talking to an Indigenous people's audience or something like that. And he said that was very concerning, that surely I believe one or the other. But actually the fact is that you have to be able to communicate in different languages to different audiences. So I think there's a real disconnect between the providers of biodiversity evidence and information and the users. So biodiversity scientists and researchers produce huge amounts of information and data, but it's quite often not packaged in ways that the people that we want to actually use it need to have it. So we might talk about endemic species and protected areas and how big they are and how great they are. But actually, if you're a decision maker in the Ministry of Finance in Uganda or somewhere, you need to know about things like how many jobs are going to be created, what can be the GDP contributions. You need to know about the economics and not about the indigeneity. So we really need to think about the information, how we collect information and make sure it's the right type and that it's produced at the right time and that it feeds into the right processes. So I just want to reflect on a couple of projects and initiatives that I've been involved in at IID, which really kind of the messages in this chapter really resonate with. The first one was a project that we called NBSAPS 2.0. And this was an initiative that we worked on with UNEP WCMC. It started in about 2012. And just as our policymakers are now in Montreal negotiating a post-2020 new global biodiversity framework, this project started shortly after previous biodiversity framework was negotiated in 2010 and the Aichi targets were agreed. And all countries had to develop their national biodiversity strategies and action plans to respond to these Aichi targets and the CBD strategic plan. And we started working with various ministries of environment in African countries who were kind of saying, we just don't understand it. We write these NBSAT, hey, look at our last one, it was great. It's got all this information about how many species we've got and where our protected areas are and what our ecosystem services are. But then it's just sat on the shelf and nobody has actually read it since it was written. What do we do about that? And this project was all about how do you make so they were all having to revise their NBSATs. How do you make your revised NBSAT more development savvy so that people in the Ministry of Planning, in the Ministry of Finance, in the Ministry of Energy or wherever will pick it up and read it? And we literally had to sort of talk through people as if we were kind of like trying to sell biodiversity. We did exercises about making a business case for biodiversity as if you were in Dragon's Den trying to sell this to somebody. And it did all largely come down to communication. Talk about jobs, talk about earning potential, talk about the kinds of things that the people in these ministries want to hear. Don't talk about biodiversity. This is another project also with UNEP WCMC. It's a GEF project called Connect. And it was basically about how do we make that connection between people that are supplying biodiversity and people, again, in African ministries that need to use biodiversity information in order to make better decisions. And this project, IIED's role in this was really sort of trying to make that connection. We're not suppliers of biodiversity information, but we do know a bit about how policy making works and trying to make the case that you really need to understand how evidence feeds into the decision-making process. So that means you need to understand the decision-making process, and quite often that decision-making process is completely political. It's not science-based at all. So we were encouraging countries to do an exercise called political economy analysis, which helps you understand basically the underlying sort of political pressures, economic and social pressures, and the reasons why things work the way they do in particular countries and in particular contexts. Why decisions are made about put an oil pipeline here rather than over here. And it quite often comes down to the different powers that different stakeholders use, who can influence who holds the purse strings, far more so than anything to do with the ecology of a particular area. A political economy analysis also helps you understand decision-making processes, like when does the budget get reviewed? How does it get reviewed? How does it get allocated to different departments? What are the key meetings that you need to be in order to put your proposals together to get your share of the budget? This is a really brief summary. We produced a guide to political economy analysis for people that don't do political economy analysis, because I think pretty much everybody really ought to if you're working in politics and trying to influence policy. But I'm not expecting people to read this, but it basically has an awful lot in here about communication, that you need to understand your stakeholders, understand their work, but not just who they are, but what powers they have, what interests they have. Are they interested in nature or not interested in nature? Do they have any power to influence decisions about nature or not? And then use all this to inform a strategy, and it's effectively about a politically informed communication strategy to get your evidence into policy. And then finally, at the moment, we're designing a new research programme with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. It's called REDAR, Reversing Environmental Degradation in Africa and Asia. It will be launching next year. This isn't a plug for the research programme, but just to say, as part of the design of that research programme, we've been doing a number of scoping studies, and one of those is really thinking about how will the research that we're going to commission actually help feed into policy and change political decision-making, because it's not a pure academic research programme. It's what we call action research and research to policy. So it's very specifically about applied research that has the potential to influence policy. So one of the pieces of scoping that we've done is to look at other pieces of decision-making that have been made in different countries that have been influenced by research, and it's got lots of nice insights into it. Things like the agricultural development corridor in Tanzania, the new wildlife management strategy in Kenya, and so on. But it identifies a number of key strategies, like cultivating knowledge brokers. These might be people that are inside government or outside government or wherever the decision that's being made is, but they've got good connections. They're politically connected as well as being technically knowing their subject matter. It's about recognizing different types of knowledge and making sure that you include those in your analysis and in the evidence that you present. making sure that evidence is grounded in the local context and the national context. So not presenting evidence from Wales when you want to influence decision-making in England, not presenting information from England when you want to influence decision-making in Kenya. And it's also about galvanizing this civic space to encourage evidence uptake. So this is about civil society and the extent to which they can persuade policymakers to take evidence seriously and to engage in consultative processes. So these are just a couple of examples of things that we've been engaged in IIED, but they resonate hugely with this chapter on influencing policy. And I think the key message that comes from them is your evidence can be absolutely fantastic, as scientifically robust as you want it to be. But if you don't understand how policymakers work, and you don't understand how policymaking processes work and the timing of those, then your evidence will really go to waste and not be used to influence decision-making. Thank you very much. If anybody wants to follow up on
Yes, I think a series of exceptional, short and well-timed presentations that show the value of the book that Bill has edited and the team that Bill has pulled together to produce this book. So, Bill, the floor is yours. Congratulations.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for all those interesting talks and kind of unexpected comments. The way we've come to this, where a number of us come to this, was a concern over the problems with conservation. And conservation can often be fantastic. There are many species saved. There are many wonderful nature reserves. Conservation can be amazing, but it can also be deeply problematic. So I can think of going and seeing one conservation project which had spent €1 million, and there was no sign whatsoever of any benefit having happened from that project a couple of years on. And I asked whether they'd learnt the lessons from anyone else, and they said that actually they hadn't. And I asked whether or not there'd been any monitoring so anything had been learnt, and they said they hadn't. So this money had just been spent and disappeared with no grand gain. And you can think of lots of other examples. The bat bridges on the way to Norwich, it turns out bats can fly. The money spent on agri-environment schemes, that contradicted the available evidence. We said this won't work, and it didn't work, and cost billions of euros as a result. Or mangrove planting in places where we know that won't be efficient. Lots and lots of examples. So we can do it better. So in medicine, they've created evidence-based medicine, and they've tested this. They've, being medics, they did a controlled experiment and showed that if you have evidence-based medicine, you have 90% fewer deaths, and people spend 26% less time in hospital. So a very successful process. And in the book, we describe various examples of ways in which processes could be improved, that there's clear gains to be made. Perhaps sort of 20 to 40% saving. I'd like to talk about something that isn't in the book, an example. I've asked the question, and you can think about this yourself. Supposing we had access to the published literature and reports, and supposing we knew the experiences of our organization and other organizations as to what works and what didn't work. If we had all of that information, how much money could we save and still deliver the same biodiversity outcomes? By not doing things that are ineffective, by doing things more effective. So I asked that on Twitter, got about 120 responses, and the median response was 20 to 40%. That could be entirely Russian bots, who knows? So I've done the same by asking a group of over 30 serious experts. Almost all of them say we could save over 50%. So there's a widespread appreciation that we just do this a lot more effectively. We call this the inefficiency paradox. We spend tens of billions of dollars a year on conservation. We could, by acting more efficiently, save enormous amounts of money or deliver conservation more effectively. But we don't, because we somehow don't manage to get together to work out how to be more effective. And that's curious. And that's one of the reasons why we produced this book. And it comes initially, Rebecca Smith pulled together the list and the names. Her paper names 1,100 people who were involved in the collation of the evidence or a set of tools in order to make evidence use more effective. And there are two main lessons that come out from this book. One of the lessons is we need to be more strategic. And the other lesson is we need a cultural change in how we work. So what do I mean by that? Then being strategic, you need to have the evidence collated and sitting there so we can look it up instantaneously. And particularly we're interested in what we call bespoke synthesis or dynamic synthesis. So you can have a synthesis for your particular situation, as Nancy described earlier. We don't necessarily, you don't want an example that relates to kangaroos or something like that. You want to be able to do your own analysis. And we're developing ways in which that can be done and using AI to assist that and AI to, in collaboration with Google, to create those searches. But also that collation of evidence, I think, needs to go further. Tom White's been working on the collation of the importance of costs. We need a cost database. We need collation of data on threats, etc. So we need to have that sitting there. We also need decision support tools and guidance. And I think we as a community need to find ways of being strategic and having that information collated and ready. And I think CCI could play a key role there. We need a cultural shift. We need a cultural shift. So it's just unthinkable not to use the evidence. In the same way as it's unthinkable for your doctor to not use the evidence, or your airplane company not to use the evidence as to how planes fly safely. We should just have it routinely. And that means creating some new techniques in the way people have discussed already, new techniques in expert elicitation, in the assessment of evidence, in the decision-making tools, the embedding of evidence into processes. That can all be done. And how do we do that? We do that by organizations thinking about how they can learn from failure, auditing the evidence they use, having an evidence use plan, having training and capacity building. And the book has 7 examples of organizations that have switched to being evidence-based organizations. So you might think that this is all some long-term, expensive fantasy. So I'd like to give 3 examples of things that could be done before Christmas. The first example is CBD in Montreal. They have a list of targets, and it doesn't really include science or evidence. That somehow all these scientists getting together are going to have a set of policies that don't state the need to have science centrally embedded in the processes, combined with other sorts of knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, whatever, but science itself being strongly there and defended. And if we're not careful, that's not going to be part of the product. And I know various people in this building who are getting together in order to try and change that, but I think that is really important. The second example I'd like to give, and there's some people online that might not know about UK political history. It's got a bit complicated. We had a prime minister, we've had many prime ministers recently. We had a prime minister recently who introduced a budget which wasn't enormously popular and then resigned a couple of days later. And I don't want to criticize the nature of that budget or what was in that budget. You know, that's a different issue. What I do want to condemn is the process, and it's now becoming clear, the process by which that decision was made. I want to condemn that process. Supposing almost any of our speakers have been prime minister, supposing we had a process whereby you have to, as part of the civil service, as part of the decision-making process, you have to diagnose what the problem is. You have to view what the range of options are that people have considered for this sort of problem around the world. You have to collate the evidence as to what's likely to be effective or not effective in relation to the sorts of solutions you're assessing. You have to evaluate that evidence to work out what it means for this particular decision, quite possibly by embedding in models. You have to use expert elicitation in the way Nibu has described. You have to embed, you'll make your decision using one of the structured decision-making processes like consequence tables or argument maps. And then you have to embed that decision within some structured process. The question is, if we had done that, would we now be looking for the 30 billion pounds that we're currently looking for? And I would suggest almost certainly not. I would suggest that we need to change society so it's just unthinkable to not use those sorts of processes. And if you don't, society should question it. And then the final example I'd like to give, if you happen to be running an organization and someone running an organization has just come into the room, so well, what can you actually do before Christmas to change your organization? So we have, in the book, we have 12 checklists of ways in which we can change different aspects. And these are some of the easy wins that conservationists, CEOs could adapt today. You know, so make sure that job interviews specify the need for understanding evidence-based pharmacy. Make that decision, you're going to do that. Make someone responsible for creating a strategy for evidence use. Establish a process of creating training and principles. These are all easy wins that could be done now, and one hopes that this is going to happen. So the lessons, I think, is that we face serious problems. We face serious problems, including the fact that by not using evidence effectively, we're being enormously less effective than we could do. And that if we used evidence more effectively, not only would we save money and gain effectiveness, but I think we attract more money. And that's one of our objectives, is to bring more money into this field by showing how effective we can be. But we need new tools. And as Mark said, the creation of those tools is kind of a long way of, we're working on, still have further to go. But it seems that we're creating the toolkit where we can change the way in which we can operate, hopefully become a lot more effective, a lot more cost effective. So we hope that many of these measures could be adapted and we could end up transforming conservation and improving the planet. Thank you.
And thank you to all the authors that have contributed to the book. Bill, yes, I have made a note of it.
I'll test you on them.
Yeah, great. That's my fear. There will be a lot of questions and a lot of conversations. And so I invite you to move through to the common room and join us for a glass of wine and some further conversation. But Bill and the team and all the speakers here and online, thank you very much.